in terms of my engineering and scientific knowledge, I would be 100% certain that there will not be human beings on this planet in about 15 years.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you all for being here. First and foremost, anyway, it's a pleasure to have you here for this conversation. And I'll just introduce myself. My name is James Desmond. I'm from Cork City in Ireland. And just an overall view quickly is that I've been aware now of the climate issue and been, working with a number of people on, different topics of it, and how do we look and think about going forward with what we're facing, basically. And the object of the video here is to actually try and have a truthful conversation that the average lay person can mainly understand on the street, because there's a lot of information going around and most people are getting fairly confused with the issues. So without further ado, I would like to, if I can, if I may, I would like to start off with a fellow Irishman. I'll introduce Mr. John Doyle. And John, it's a pleasure. Basically, I would ask you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your career in the European Union and where that has led you to this day, or to today. Thanks.
Delighted to do so. Who has the cat? I hear a cat. It's fantastic. No? Oh, it's wonderful, because I have two dogs sitting behind me, which is hilarious. So yeah, and I know Shackleton is far more famous than Paul will ever be. So it's wonderful to see that we've got animals here. So John Doyle is the name. Worked in the Commission for a large number of years. Back in about 2004, I was proposed to join this very select band who were doing something called the Lisbon Strategy, which was to make of Europe the most competitive knowledge-based society in the world. And it was all very interesting. We had sort of horizontal as well as country responsibilities. We were going around places, meeting terribly important people and setting them objectives. And I got my work done fairly quickly. Maybe I was lucky I got some easy countries to do, or maybe I'm just quite quick. And then I found myself bored, always a dodgy thing to be, and walked down the corridor in the Berlaymont and came across two wonderful women who were writing the first ever sustainable development strategy. And of course, being an arrogant male Irish engineer, I was just sniggering at this crap. I had no idea what it meant. Thought it was what you club of what Rome, who are they, and the whole thing was comical to me. And but then I started talking to them. Then I met a wonderful man that many of you will know, the marvelous David Wasdell of the Meridian Project in the UK. And then I realized what was actually going on. And I often say to people that I walked into that bloody room and I never walked out. So some 20 years later, I'm still essentially in that room, staggered by what I discovered there and what I have tried to do since. I've realized only recently, probably due to COVID lockdown, that much of what I have tried to do since was both arrogant and misplaced. It consisted very largely of shouting at people and telling them how stupid they were, and trying desperately to get people to pass legislation and change things. I even succeeded in getting legislation passed that changed nothing. So at the beginning of the COVID lockdown, I had a kind of a series of revelations that I found. I found myself going more into myself, trying to understand feelings, trying to understand the broader concept of what it is to be a human being in this world. As distinct from purely a scientist or a techie or an engineer, what does it mean to be a human being in this world? And then what I've come to see as, in all probability, these end times. And it certainly seemed to me to take me a little bit away from shouting and screaming at people and telling them that they were just idiots. I realized that the system is actually the people. So it's remarkably easy to have a bunch of people in a pub in Ireland agree that the Chinese should stop using coal-fired oil plants. But it's remarkably difficult to get the Irish to agree that maybe we should eat less beef. it, it's remarkably easy to get the European Union to sort of say, oh, we should reduce those emissions that are very easy for us to reduce. But China should reduce its emissions on making all the things that we actually use, that we don't count the embedded emissions. It's remarkably easy to get everyone to agree that it's somebody else's problem. And there comes a point where you suddenly realize that this is maybe the nature of things. And I try to give a fresh perspective whenever I'm speaking for fear of repeating myself. So one of the things I've had to come to terms with is facing the world as it actually is, rather than the way I would like it to be, which is a hell of a challenge. So one of my big heroes died recently, a wonderful man called Desmond Tutu. He was a big friend of the Irish, a great character, loved a pint of Guinness. And as Bob Geldof said in a recent obituary, he was the most wonderfully entertaining man and must have been an absolute nightmare to live with. And I thought, yes, Bob definitely knew this guy. And one of the things that struck me about Tutu was I was still in my late teens when he set up the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and I'll never forget watching, possibly not live, but certainly very soon after it was done, the moment when they reenacted the killing of Stephen Biko. It was incredible, and he got the police officers to kneel on the floor and show how they. And then there was another white lady whose husband was into conservation or something. She said, we just answered the door and 3 guys just blew my husband's head off and his brains went all over my children. And but there was something about this. I was thinking, oh, this is such an extraordinarily different thing to do. This man seemed to be plugged into some kind of humanity that was stunning to me. It blew me away. And he was always a huge hero in my mind. But his best mate, Nelson Mandela, to the day he died, believed passionately in the violent overthrow of oppressive regimes. He never renounced violence, irrespective of all the kind of rewriting of history that has gone on, the attempts to turn him into some sort of a secular saint. He wasn't. He was a violent man who believed in violence. He was very violent to his first wife. He was a man he was a man. He was another type of man. And this is part of what I find myself facing now, facing the reality of what it is that we are and what we do, not what I wish we were and what I wish we did. I won't go much further because I said that there are far more interesting people to talk to about this. But the thought, for me, one of the things that we have to be brave enough to do is face the unthinkable. So I have faced the unthinkable in the sense that in terms of my engineering and scientific knowledge, I would be 100% certain that there will not be human beings on this planet in about 15 years. I'm not saying it'll be a smooth transition. I don't know when the dart will hit the board. And that is, I consider that a scientific certainty. Nevertheless, it might not happen. And it's not relevant whether it happens or not. That's, I think, what I'd like to bring to this meeting, because it doesn't matter what is going to happen. What matters is how we behave. I've found myself increasingly thinking that when people say to me, but yeah, I mean, what do you mean we can't do anything about it? And I say, well, if we can't do anything about it, that means everything else is left to be done. What should we be doing? Where should our hearts be? How should we be behaving? In the East, the tradition is that right action is its own reward. No attachment to the outcomes. So that's what I'm trying. Now, this does not mean I'm not working furiously with friends and energy transitions and all sorts of stuff. I love participating in these things. As I have all sorts of ideas that I still try and push through, and et cetera, and that won't stop. But I'm certain. But I do what I feel I should do, in as much as I can do this consistent with who I am and the way the Tao is passing through me, or however you want to put it. So I invite people in some respects to give up both hope and fear and face the world as it is, not as you wish it was. Thank you, James. Thanks especially for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
You're more than welcome, John. I just want to say that, again, an Irishman, they don't like to cut, they always cut to the chase. I think anyone who's sitting would watch and listening would understand exactly where you're coming from. I just want to leave with a quote of your own from the conversation you had with Hart just recently. And I found a poignant statement that you said in how you deal or how you face how you face things with the knowledge of what's happening. And you say you face it with that little thought in the back of your mind, where were we able to actually crack something? Well, then who knows? But the cracking of something is contingent upon actually accepting the way it is. And therefore, unless we accept it the way it is, then we cannot actually plan accurately for how to deal with it. So that is the actual, overall essence of the meeting here is today. It really is for people to actually start to learn to accept, to learn to understand first by getting off the mainstream and start looking at the right information. Because I know myself that you're all among the academic field and you've been crying for years about what's going on, and it's somehow always been diluted before it comes out on the public, the public media or through our politicians. It's always a diluted, a diluted version that they get, and we can't deal with diluted versions when we're trying to solve a complex, condensed problem. So the overall issue is our heating problem or overheating problem, and the heating that has been basically retained in our oceans for the last especially in the last number of decades. It's increased so much now, and 93% of our heat is being withheld in the oceans at the moment. And the average person out there doesn't realize that it's where most of the retained heat that has not been able to naturally go back off into space as it does. It's always been on an equilibrium for millennia. We're at a stage now where we're containing and trapping heat over the last number of decades, if not centuries now, because of the CO2 and the greenhouse gases. I'd like to talk about some of the greater effects that have been the cause of the greenhouse gas emissions and warming. And so I leave it to Dr. Sailesh Rao. It's a pleasure. Dr. Sailesh Rao from Climate Healer. Take it away, Sailesh.
Thank you, James. I sympathize with your cat who's been trying to get your attention for so long, because I think all the animals have been trying to do that for so long.
Yeah. Unfortunately, she's a constant attention seeker, whereas her brother is content to sit on the sink and learn to tap dance.
Yes. I am a systems engineer, and I started working on this in 2005 when I saw Al Gore's presentation on TV, and I was so shocked. And I said, if half of what he's saying is true, I'm wasting my time working on the internet, which is what I was doing at that time. So I started studying this, and I realized very soon that it's far worse than what Mr. Gore was saying, and that he's missing a big piece of the puzzle, which is what we are doing to the land, what we are doing to the ocean in the pursuit of animal eating or animal consumption. And I started studying that in more detail, and I wrote letters to him in 2009 and 2012. I got no response. I mean, I got one response for 2009 and no response in 2012, and I pretty much walked out of the Climate Reality Project in 2012, saying if you're not going to address animal agriculture, you're not serious. So that began a more detailed study. I was fortunate that in 2010 my granddaughter was born, because until then I was depressed. I thought that we were going to hell in a handbasket, that there's nothing I can do about it. But when she was born, I held her in my arms for the first time when she was a month old, and she looked up at me and she smiled. And she had this beautiful smile, as if she was saying, what do you mean I don't belong? I belong exactly as I am, and you're a fool, you haven't understood me yet. So I began looking at things from a different perspective since then. And I said, what if nature has been using us to stabilize the climate of the planet for 10,000 years. And she did, and we did. We kept the temperature constant for 10,000 years. And then over the last 200 years, we've increased it by 1.1 degrees. And in the process, we have built all the tools and technologies we need to understand what we have done and therefore become conscious as the climate harmonizing species of the planet. Because as soon as we admit that humans are changing the climate of the planet, we own the climate. We own the climate of the planet. We have responsibility for maintaining it, harmonizing it, and keeping it stable for all of the rest of creation. So I said, so as part of that, we have increased it by 1 degree. So now how do you bring it back down? How do we cool it and then stabilize it and keep it stable forever? And that begins a water dance. So I don't call it solar radiation management. It is a water dance. Because by changing the water cycle, we have literally caused the climate to heat, the planet to heat. And by changing how water presents itself on Earth, whether in the form of ice, which reflects sunlight, or in the form of clouds that absorb sunlight or reflect sunlight, depending on whether they are tiny particles or black clouds. So water has this beautiful resonance with life and with the sun, so that it causes life to thrive on the planet, or if we misuse it, it causes life to die on the planet. And one of the first things I realized is that on land, we have chopped down half the trees in order to raise animals. And I calculated that if we just bring back those trees, we can literally sequester all the CO2 that we have put into the atmosphere and more. So we have the opportunity, if we get to a vegan world and we stop burning down 30 million acres of forests every year and bottom trawling and scouring 4 billion acres of the ocean seafloor every year, we can literally let nature begin to heal. But in the process, we may have to create, and we have to understand what kind of clouds do trees create. Do they create clouds that heat the earth, or do they create clouds that Dr. Salter has been talking about, these tiny particles? Maybe that's what trees create. We don't know. I mean, someone has to study these things to see how. See, as a systems engineer, I say we need to model first what it is that we are trying to do. And then we have to constantly be on our toes to make sure that reality matches our models. And so we have to keep updating our models as we go along. So, but I have started something called the World Food Healers Day on November 19th of this year, which is the day after COP27 ends. COP27 is from November 7th through 18th, and it's in Egypt, which is a very repressive regime. So obviously no one's going to be sitting around protesting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And perhaps that's by design. So in any case, I'm boycotting COP27 because I'm sick and tired of what these people are doing, and they're absolutely doing nothing. I was there in Glasgow for COP26, and we had a cow that represented the cow in the room that they're not addressing. And so COP27 we are boycotting, and the day after COP27 ends, we are celebrating World Food Healers Day, because on that day we are going to feed every human being on the planet a healthy vegan meal. A healthy, whole food, plant-based vegan meal will be freely available to every human being on the planet. That's our goal. And I already have Food Not Bombs on board. We have Food for Life Global on board. They're already serving in over 1,000 cities and over 60 countries, and they're on board. They are all excited about this. And we are trying to sign up every vegan restaurant on the planet to join and open their doors and give away food for free on that day. Because we want to address world hunger from the grassroots, from the ground up, and show our leaders that we can do this ourselves. And if they don't get their act together, they're going to become irrelevant. So that's our goal. And so I believe in actually doing things and acting out, and not just talking about things. So that's how that's my input to this. And I would love to hear from all of you. I'm sorry that I have another meeting in 22 minutes, but that was scheduled before this. So with that, I pass the talking feather.
Thank you, Sailesh. Yeah, there is no doubt that the food is a vital part of the whole system, and we have a lot of thinking. We have a lot of thinking about a lot of things that we need to think about, basically. But we can't think about them as John said earlier in his quote, we have to face them first.
A couple of things, Sailesh. Maybe you can speak to the amount of food wastage that we have. I hear numbers from about 30% to 50% of food wastage. So if you envision, or if, I fully expect that, the risk of global food shortages within, say, a decade, 5 to 10 years, is getting higher and higher all the time with extreme weather events. So when food prices, say, double or triple, do you think that will, surely one of the things is that people will waste a lot less food. So if we waste, if we get rid of that wastage, we could actually, that can be one mechanism to withstand global food shortage. And then, as you've mentioned, of course, going to plant-based diets, becoming vegans, would have a huge impact if the world was to take that up. And do you think that that's the way the world will head as food prices continue to accelerate?
Yeah, great question. I see the food system as a microcosm of the system that we are in. The food system as it's designed today is all about death, disease, and destruction. Death for the animals, diseases for human beings, and destruction for the planet. And we make money off death, disease, and destruction, and that's why it's stuck in that system. And what we are proposing on World Food Healers Day is to create a food system in which we give to everyone healthy food. Because until we heal ourselves, we don't heal the planet. We cannot heal the planet. So it's about giving healthy food, healthy vegan food to every human being on the planet. That's all about health, happiness, and harmony. And so we are sort of creating a food system of health, happiness, and harmony. And therefore, letting people imagine how we could create an entire system around that. Okay. So that's the idea.
Very interesting. I noticed Jamin has a hand up and John has a hand up here. And when we hear from the two, I'm conscious of time, so I will move on to Paul as soon as Jamin and John have it.
Yes, thank you, James. I'll make my point very quickly, which is that so much of the conversation in the last few minutes presupposes the existing food system, right? One of the things that Sailesh and I and other colleagues are working on, I'm in Los Angeles right now working intensively on this, is called Food Healers, where we make large quantities of plant-based stew and we distribute it to the areas that need it. So instead of a crop going to a distributor and then distributed to retailers, and then you drive in your car and put it in a bunch of plastic and take it home to an icebox, what if the crop goes directly to a food factory where we make large, massive industrial quantities of plant-based stew, distribute it directly in exactly those quantities that people need, they eat it fresh, and we eliminate this whole wasteful supply chain, which is responsible for those 30 to 50% losses that Paul mentioned. And with that, I pass the feather to John. Thank you.
And I'll be really quick. First and foremost, blown away by both Jamin and Sailesh. I absolutely love it. I'd like to offer to be put in the loop for climate healers here in Belgium and for my fellow people in the commission. I'd also like to connect you with somebody in the UN, a wonderful lady called Maretta Johansson, who is a director of OCHA, which is the Humanitarian Intervention Office. We've been working together for quite some time, and her whole approach is about food as well. I think perhaps I recognize in Stephen and in Paul, fellow technos like myself. I'm actually an electronics engineer, you know, and I'm always into fixing things. And yeah, I'll talk about how I did some legislative innovations that actually made everything worse a little bit later. But one of the things to be remembered is what Sailesh said was we have to let the planet heal itself. I reckon we have zero chance, but I'm still going to take whatever's left out of zero. Nothingness is, after all, fruitful. And the important thing for me is to understand that if we were able to get if we were to let the earth alone, and I'm not talking about rewilding. That's crazy. People come to me and sort of say, we need to rewild Ireland. And I said, well, how would you do it? I said, oh, we'd put back the native ash and the oak. Really? Is it still native in a world that's nearly 2 degrees warmer at this stage? Have you any idea what would actually grow there? The one chance I see for our species is to retreat back, to use the minimum amount of land to feed ourselves, which would be plant-based, because you put it through a cow, you multiply by 10, 20, 100, however much that is. As I said, I was hugely converted by watching a movie called Cowspiracy a number of years ago, which changed everything for me. So again, I became a vegan about 10 years ago, having watched Cowspiracy on Christmas Eve, which didn't please a lot of people. But anyway, I'm blown away by it. It's an absolutely wonderful initiative. And yeah, I'm in.
Well, thank you to Sailesh, Dr. Sailesh Rao, for his part in the production of, and Cowconspiracy and also the Seaspiracy. And I am aware that he has it.
Hero. I had no idea you guys were involved in that. I'm now starstruck. Okay, so
we have a lot to thank Sailesh for. That's fair, and he's such a modest man. But anyway, I'm aware of the time, so I would just like to say that first of all, I'm really after relaxing, and I'm quite happy because I mean it is for the very purpose that you exactly these people here who are sitting in front of me, and I know Peter Wadhams will be here shortly if he can. But I know myself that you're the right people because of your professions, because of the peer-reviewed literature that you're talking from the simple fact that, yes, there's going to be a lot of pushback about the idea of, reducing our farming and agricultural practices and everything else in relation to animal practice and everything else. And yes, there's going to be a lot of pushback. But I would only say to those that are pushing back, bring your peer-reviewed literature that's in contrary to what the science is saying at the moment, and we'll maybe entertain an argument from you there. Without that, I'll just leave it at that and say I would like to again introduce Mr. Paul Beckwith, and Paul is I'm a great fan of Paul again, as I say, for he's been able to really concisely break down what's happening with our systems for the average person to understand. So I'd like Paul to maybe, if you could take Paul from where I would have been expecting Professor Wadhams to give us a talk about what's happening in the Arctic, and you may take it from there and tell us a little about how the tipping points and that are coming into play because of that are affecting our systems in general. Thanks, Paul.
Well, thank you. And if there is a bit of background noise, it seems like there's some cows in the room up above me. I'm in the basement and I hear people, it's an old house and people are sort of puttering around in the kitchen. And it sounds like there's elephants or cows up there. So anyway, thanks for asking me to be on this, James and James. Yeah, so you're probably, I'm not going to go into a lot of details about my, like I do, you all know I do the videos, many YouTube videos on the climate system, abrupt climate system change, and also have my blog paulbeckwith.net. And I've been very, very concerned about the rapidity of climate change for many, many years. we constantly hear in the news or read about climate is happening much faster than expected, all these unexpected extreme weather events, etc. So if everything continues to be happening faster than expected and unexpected, we obviously have to change our expectations. I'm talking about the climate community. Okay, they need to really step up to the plate. There has been a lot of reticence, as James Hansen has talked about within the scientific community, about how quickly things are changing, about talking, people watching sort of guarded talk, not saying what they really think and feel about the system. And of course, science is very, very siloed. You have people studying one specific aspect of the climate system, be it a glacier or one little tiny aspect, and not making a connection to the overall system. So we need more and more people in academia and people making policy in government, et cetera, who are thinking about the overall system. So we know that our emissions have pushed the climate so far in terms of changing the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans, and the way that heat is stored on the planet, and the way that heat is distributed from the equator to the poles via the ocean circulation and the atmospheric patterns, the jet streams, of course. We've changed the entire system. We've been hitting it with a sledgehammer for a long, long time. And it's no surprise that we're in a lot of trouble now, that it's changing. And, with the loss of Arctic sea ice and the darkening of the Arctic, of course, that's in a sort of a spiral feedback loop, self-reinforcing feedbacks, which is going to lead to complete loss of Arctic sea ice very, very soon. And, then the extreme weather events that we are subject to around the planet will get worse and worse, and it will become more and more difficult to grow food, and thus leading to the global food shortages. And whenever a time frame or schedule is given in academia, in peer-reviewed papers, within a few years, it's always modified to be much faster than what people expected. So, I was just looking this morning, Mike Farragon in Scotland sent me a graph from Barrow, Alaska, of methane, for example. And the graph started in 1988 and goes to now. In the 13 years, the methane rose about 100 parts per billion, or 7.7 parts per billion per year. In the last year, the methane has risen almost the same amount. So what took a decade, more than a decade, if this data holds, and if it continues, the methane rise, as measured in flask measurements in Barrow, Alaska, has increased a factor of 10 times in the rate that it's going into the atmosphere. So, yeah, it's incredible. Like in the last year, the methane on this graph has gone up, about 70 to 80 parts per billion. Now, hopefully this is just a glitch. This is a fluctuation. If it's not, we know probably where that methane is coming from in the Arctic, the permafrost, thawing permafrost, the methane on the seafloor in sediments, et cetera, et cetera. So, or the hydroxide sponge, not sponge, but the hydroxide, which breaks down methane. Maybe the levels have dropped significantly, because that would also cause an increase of or an apparent rise in the atmosphere. So things like this, they more or less happen every day or every week that there's some huge surprise in the climate system, which has huge consequences and is unrecognized in the general public and unrecognized to any scientists that are studying that specific area, unless these scientists are like myself and others who are looking at the overall climate system. So another thing in the last week is the I have friends, and whenever something's happening in the Arctic or Antarctic, they quickly send me stuff and let me know. So it makes me a bit lazy sometimes, because if I don't hear from X, then the Arctic's okay, right? Or if I don't hear from Y, then the Antarctic's okay. So the recent behavior of Antarctic sea ice is also very surprising. It seems we're at record low levels for Antarctic sea ice for this time of year, and it seems to be plummeting, well below any previous measurement. So this is another flag, if you like. So we're getting more and more of these things happening, and in terms of sequestering. So I've talked about the three-legged bar stool, where we need to. I mean, we're still subsidizing fossil fuel companies to obscene amounts, and many governments, or a number of governments, promised in 2009 that they would phase out fossil fuel subsidies, and that hasn't happened. And with the recovery money from COVID, that also that money, the recovery money, has gone into fossil fuel stuff. That could have gone into renewables and other things. It was a perfect opportunity, but it didn't. What others were saying about no attachment to outcomes is very important. Give up hope and fear, face the world as it really is. That's all excellent advice for how one, whether it be one of us or anybody else that recognizes how grave and risky the whole climate system is. So the three-legged bar stool involves slashing fossil fuel usage, which starts with completely getting rid of the subsidies. I mean, it's like we talk about a price on carbon. I mean, that's a negative price on carbon. It's like supplying the bullets to the gun, shooting ourselves repeatedly in the foot and elsewhere. And we need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. There's no question. CO2, methane, pull it out of when I say the atmosphere, pull it out of the atmosphere or ocean, because it's a dynamic system. If we pull it out of one, it will come out of the other one. Pull it out of the ocean, and levels will drop in the atmosphere. But we also need, we have vital urgency for deployment of things that will cool the planet. I'm talking about Stephen Salter's marine cloud brightening, talking about ideas like MER, which is mirrors on the surface of the Earth. I talked recently about deployment of mirrors in space, which I think the price is going to be much lower than we could have imagined, given the SpaceX advances in really slashing the price by a factor of 10 or 20 of the cost per kilogram getting up to orbit. So but I mean, I'm talking about deployment, and we put nowhere near enough money into this. I've talked for a long time about the importance of getting, military budgets, telling the US military, okay, you're doing climate stuff for a year or two. You use the weapons that you have, but no more. That your knowledge and expertise of tens of thousands of engineers goes towards addressing climate change. How do we pull carbon from the atmosphere? How do we cool the planet, et cetera, et cetera? So, it's sort of, we compartmentalize to deal with the stuff we do. and then like 3 storms hit us in the UK or Cork, in Ireland, and we say, well, geez, we're right in the thick of it. I mean, the UK had 122 mile an hour winds, I believe, category 3 hurricane force winds, and just the storm, recently. But I see that as there's more and more pressures from climate change, extreme weather events costing huge amounts of money, collapse of things like insurance companies, and governments not dealing with it, that I see as there's more and more uncertainty, then people tend to become more tribal. There's more tribalism, which is exactly what this type of occupation / protest / siege was. So I see that this is going to be a huge problem that many democratic governments are going to have to face and deal with. And I see it all I don't see it as a trucker protest or occupation. I see it as societal disruption. I see it as a path along the way to complete collapse of democratic governments under the huge onslaught of abrupt climate system change. A perfect example is, at the New Year's, right? The Colorado wildfires, which tore through, it actually burned down, many homes of people that work at NOAA and work on weather forecasting, University of Denver. So many climate scientists and meteorologists were directly affected and lost their homes and city, villages, etc. So it's hitting home to everybody. So is Stephen next? I mean, we absolutely, need funding to follow these to deploy, to build equipment and deploy and get moving on it. But
yes, I agree 100%. I mean, initially a couple of years ago, we heard of Dr. Ye Tao's mirror reflection program, and it seems one of the least invasive methods that's been proposed. But as you know, given the essence of the time and scale and everything involved with the heating and the imminent heating and warming, that could actually go beyond any intervention.
Yeah, I mean, just wait till the next El Nino hits, in a couple of years, a year or 2 or 3, whatever, when we get the next El Nino warming event, it's going to blow away any records, and
exactly.
Maybe it'll be a wake-up point.
I was also grateful for the fact that in your COP26 recap video that you spoke out and told the truth about the the changing of the industrial age, the time on the dates, letting people think, oh, we're only 1.2, but if we really add in the 1750 line of the pre-industrial age, you're actually adding another 0.3 onto that 1.2 that's already been admitted. So they're lying to people saying we have to keep it below 1.5, when we all know here we've gone past 1.5 by now anyway. So the essence is the heat. The essence is trying to do something about cooling the Arctic, and the only viable and non-invasive and affordable, just unbelievably crazy affordable, plan and solution for this is the only one that I've heard is from Professor Stephen Salter from the University of Edinburgh. And I'm actually very proud of the fact as well that Professor Salter's work is follows on the actual studies and findings of Professor Sean Toomey, a fellow Corkman, who was in 1971 found all these information about cloud albedo and everything else, which led on to John Latham and Alan Gideons, and now Professor Salter, an engineer, has come up with an ingenious way to, as I said, non-invasive And I know John has the thing about building technologies, and you can't build a machine to clean up the mess the machine made. I understand that, but when in relation to cooling the Arctic, once these machines are built, they're wind and power driven, they're wind and wave driven anyway. They're autonomous, and they will no longer be causing heat. They will be doing quite the opposite. They will be creating cooling effects, and with the possibility, God willing, of actually saving the Arctic. But I'll leave it to Professor Salter to give us a presentation on marine cloud brightening. Thanks.
Right, I'm going to try sharing my screen now. And I want to go to, I think I want to go to that one. Okay, I'm going to try and squash this down to the 10 minutes you asked for, and it's for you to send on to other people. I think Paul knows all about this already. The UK government policy, and the policy of lots of other governments, with predictable exceptions, is to just stop emitting CO2. And they've been doing this actually for nearly 50 years since the first conferences. And you can see all the conferences here up to COP26. And you can see the effect of these conferences on the slope, even the acceleration of the slope in the wrong direction. So really, how much longer do you need to go on before you understand that this isn't going to work? The next slide is trying to show you what's happening with particularly the higher latitudes. This is telling you the temperature difference change from some previous values. And you can see that there's a great deal of extra heating going on in the north end, 5 degrees centigrade extra. And you know that that's melting the ice, so that instead of being a brilliantly good reflector, you've got a very, very good absorber of open water. And we've also got the methane coming up. And the next slide here is a rather familiar one. And you'll notice that the clouds vary in their whiteness, their reflectivity. There is quite a nice white one, and here's a slight darkish grey one. And this was studied by this gentleman here, Sean Toomey, and he was very interested in why there were some clouds looked grey and some looked white, and he was able to fly over clouds and measure how much energy was coming down from above and how much was coming up from below. And he was also able to fly into the clouds and scoop samples of the cloud drops and measure how many there were per cubic centimeter and also what the sizes were. And he did a lot of very useful work for this, and it's been replicated, and the replication is very good agreement. And the conclusion is that the size distribution of the drops in the cloud will set its reflectivity. If you have a lot of small drops, you get a bright cloud, a white cloud, and if the same amount of liquid water is in a smaller number of big ones, then it's a lot darker. And you've heard the expression, the dark storm clouds are gathering. That's when the drops are getting nearly big enough to fall as rain. And you can do a lovely little demonstration of this with glass balls. The optics is the same with water and glass. And these are 4mm balls in this jar here. And those are 40 micron balls in this jar here. And you can see the reflectivity of this is about 0.6, and this is about 0.9. Now, so it all depends on cloud drops. And to make a cloud drop, you need to have the high humidity, but you also have to have a little seed for it to start growing on. There's a thing called a condensation nucleus. And what matters is the weight of the material dissolved in the water that's going to cause this nucleation. And for sodium chloride, you need to get about 10 to the minus 14 grams of salt in a drop of water to get this curve here. And you can see you don't need a very much higher relative humidity. Here's relative humidity up here to get this to get over a hump here and then continue growing. If you have a smaller drop with less salt in, you have to get up, let's say this red one here, go up to this point here for it to then start really growing seriously. If it's below here, you go, different humidities will just change the size of the drop. It'll be evaporating or condensing, going up and down there. And this blue one has to get up to this relative humidity before it can go over the hump and keep growing. So this was Kohler back in 1936. And John Latham knew all about Toomey, and he knew all about Kohler, and he thought that we might be able to increase the number of the condensation nuclei over the sea, which gives you more chance of getting a larger number of smaller drops. And he worked out how much water you'd have to spray to evaporate to give you the salt residues, and he was amazed at how little would be needed. And we need to know what the concentration of condensation nuclei is. There's lots and lots of them over the sea, but sorry, lots and lots of them over land. So please correct that. But over the sea, we got these large areas of dark blue, which is around about 20 of the condensation nuclei in a cubic centimeter. Over land, there could be 1,000 or 5,000, but there's only 20 to 30 to 40, maybe a few places up to perhaps 50 or 100. This means that we need to find places where we've got the sun coming in and we've got the clean air. The amount of water we need to spray is very, very small. This slide shows all the red dots are estimates of how much salt is being thrown out by breaking waves now, plotted against the years. So that's 1960 and 2000. So there's a lot of salt being thrown up now. The average of all these dots is this blue circle here. But if you look, you can just see a black line here, and that's the amount of salt that we would need to more than correct all the damage we've done up to now. There's an engineering problem of how to make the spray, and this is a block diagram of the system, which I'm just showing it to you so that you realize that it exists. I'm not going to try and explain it in the time available. I could show you this drawing, which is the engineering parts of the all the bits that you need to filter the seawater and sterilize it and get rid of the plankton and then squirt it up. And it's built into a number of different plug-in canisters along here. And again, I just want you won't be able to see the detail of it, but the engineering drawings and the design calculations of this are already there and available for checking. The results of all this are showing you that we're getting a very nice increase of the cooling, -4 centigrade up here. And also it shows that we're getting nice increases in precipitation in the Sahara and the Middle East and in Australia and South Africa and in Mexico. And all these bluey green things are increases up 10 to 20%. And there are reductions in precipitation, these brown ones, but they are all over the sea, mainly over the sea, the really, really bad bits. And we could provide desalination to little islands, perhaps around here, which need to get some water. Another thing we can do is to try and moderate hurricanes. And this is showing the intensity of a hurricane up here, measured in either velocity or pressure drop. And this is the sea surface temperatures that went along with it. And you can see that a high sea surface temperature is a necessary, maybe not sufficient, but it's a necessary condition for a hurricane. And what we could do would be to have ships that were sailing around spraying seawater in this area here and measuring the sea surface temperature. They would aim to get the sea surface temperatures in June and July up to numbers that were chosen by the governments of the countries in this region here. Nobody's brave enough to promise we'll never get another hurricane, but they could say we'll try and get as close to the temperatures that you like to have, and you can pay us how close we can get to them. And we'd have ships that were cruising around here, measuring the sea surface temperature and adjusting how hard they had to work to get to the temperatures that the governments want around here. And that is my 10 minutes. However, I'd like to try and show you another slide here, which is about sea surface. No, I need to get back to, we're talking about sea surface temperatures and the deep water. And if I go to Island Slim, I think it's called. Right. This slide here, I've never heard of a zetajoule before, but it's really quite frightening. You can see that we've been doing about 300 zetajoules in 30 years, and it's 10 to the 21. That's really quite frightening. And if I go down through this, I'll show you this diagram. This is a longer version of what you've seen. Here we are. If we want to reduce sea level, we want to go all the way down. It's about 2,000 meters is where the warm bit is. And we need to get rid of 350 times 10 to the 21 joules. And if we did it with the size of boats that I think we need 400 of them in 20 years to get the temperature down by 2 degrees. And that is actually doable and not very expensive. And the value of the benefit to cost ratio of doing that, according to the estimates of the costs of rising sea levels, which I don't suppose are very accurate, the benefit to cost ratio is 50,000, which is really rather a good return on an investment. And I will leave with this poor little picture here. So that's now 12 minutes. Can I answer any questions?
I have a question.
As an engineering proposition and being a fellow engineer, I'm wonderfully impressed by your comments and by your presentation and by the ingenuity. I also spoke with Laute on the Mere Reflection project, I think last week or the week before, and the difficulties are well they're manifold. But let's start with the obvious one, the political difficulties. Even Laute will admit and his people that yes, we can do this, but we need all these people who agree to this, and there would have to be all these flanking measures. Now that's a massive difficulty. So the minute somebody in one country feels that his rainfall has been adversely affected, well, then you can imagine airplanes or submarines taking out some of your ships. So there's a massive political issue here. We can't agree on much smaller things than actually engineering the globe's climate. So that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is that your picture of the polar bear and the fact that maybe you could stop him crying ignores the fact that most climate systems and the way the climate reacts are path dependent. So in other words, a tipping point has two implications. It's that you go into a new state and that you can't reverse that state so easily. It's like tempering chocolate. Once chocolate has gone into a different crystalline state, you can't get it back to the original crystalline state. So the notion if this was an implication of what you presented, it is an erroneous implication that we can reverse what is happening in the Arctic, that the Arctic sea ice can grow back, that the Mont Blanc glacier can start climbing back up Mont Blanc or whatever. This will not happen. We will go somewhere. We may well. I'm not saying you can't necessarily cool the climate, but you will cool it. It will be in a completely different state. This is something of a problem for me. Moving on to the more technical aspects, as I understand it, the nuclei around which rainfall is currently generated, the dimethyl sulfide from sort of algae farts across the ocean, right? So I mean that's what provides what you would need to enhance. So much of it is dimethyl sulfide. Indeed, I think the way dimethyl sulfide works was one of Lovelock's suggestions that Earth did in fact act in a kind of a Gaia type way. So I would have a worry there that what you're doing is replacing a system and presuming the existing system or your baseline system will continue to function, because I strongly suspect that the existing natural systems will collapse much more quickly than we thought. Much of the algae producing DMS presumably disappear with dropping pH rates in the oceans. To get back to a quick reference that James made on my Pink Panther vacuum cleaner, of course, again, were we able to agree that the only energy being used at the moment would go into, for example, this type of thing and windmills connected to electrolyzers producing clean hydrogen, and that once we had built those, then what we would use them for would be to build another generation of these things. In other words, were we to bootstrap the entire system? Yes, of course, it's just about doable. My argument has always been that nobody's prepared to bootstrap the entire system. So how do you get to that point? So those are just a few thoughts off that, but I mean, absolutely wonderful, and I love the calculations, etc. So those would be just a couple of thoughts off the top.
If you're allowed to release CO2, why should you not be allowed to release sea salt? We know that CO2 is
because humans are complicated. Humans are complicated apes. I mean, you are asking a totally logical question, and as an engineer, I 100% agree with you. Of course, but that doesn't mean that everybody else is going to agree with you. I 100% agree with you, but as I said, the notion that people will do it, that's another question.